Once you get humbled by nature, people tend to ruminate on things that are causing them pain, suffering. It's hard. What people don't really get is how far the human body can push. At that point, once your muscles are being broken down, your organs are next on the list. It is something I would never wish on my worst enemy, that feeling of starvation. If you have a weak mind and a weak spirit, you can crumble when you shouldn't. Even though we have a button, if you are imminently gonna die, you will die in that situation. No matter how strong you are, you have to dig deep for that higher purpose, whether that's your children, your partner, or your mission. And once you're in that state, you could move mountains.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today on the channel we have Dr. Timothy Tan, who is a medical doctor, not one of those fine arts doctorates or anything like that. Not to disparage those people, we need them too. We gotta beautify the world, but we need medical doctors. He's also a Canadian military veteran, survivalist, and would you say your specialty is outdoor cold weather survival?
I would say cold weather warfare and survival.
That's even cooler. Cold weather warfare. I love it. And the founder of Survival Doctors. Timothy was also a contestant on History Channel's Alone, one of the most watched shows on the History Channel, season 9, where you spent 63 days in the Canadian wilderness with just 10 basic items.
Yeah, it was a long time, but in retrospect, it felt like a lifetime.
Tell us a bit about what got you into this whole survival stuff. How did you ever find yourself on the TV show Alone?
So Alone, it was a journey that started in childhood. You know, I had kind of almost like a frontier mentor. He came from a long line of loggers and outdoorsmen in Quebec, French-Canadian godfather to me. And we started going outdoors at a very young age. And from then, I kind of wanted to explore more and started solo traveling around the world and really got to interact with Indigenous populations. And that's where I feel like survival's in the forefront, because it's just everyday living there. And it's so impressive when someone can pop a fire with their bare hands in seconds, you know, and we're trying to fiddle around with our big lighters, you know. And I really focused in on primitive living skills when I was doing international development in East Africa. And from there, I joined the military and learned through our native rangers how to do some additional survival skills there. And then it just kind of snowballed after that.
Wow. So you have your military experience, you have your medical license, and you've been on the show Alone. I mean, if there's anybody I'm choosing, like if we had to do like a draft pick for the apocalypse and you're in the lineup, I think you're the first round pick.
Thank you.
Doesn't get much better than that. So tell me a bit about your experience on Alone. We've had Juan Pablo on. He was on the same season as you. I think he lasted 75 days. You lasted 63 days. And one of the reasons you stated for pulling the plug was you missed family. Was that part of the reason, or was there actually physical complications?
I would say the biggest thing for me on Alone season 9 was the actual physicality of it. You know, you're losing about 1.5 pounds a day, and I'm a fairly thin frame with a very fast metabolism. So I gained about 35 pounds at the outright. Juan Pablo gained 60 something.
To go like before you started.
Before, yeah. So after you're done your fat stores, your body needs some fuel. And just to give you an idea, you and I, probably anywhere from 2,000 kilocalories to 3,000 kilocalories, just doing this, our regular day-to-day in the city life. Over there, you're burning upwards of 3,000 calories at least, especially if it's cold, if you're at high altitude, if you're hunting. And in all reality, even if you're successful with your hunting, you're getting sub 1,000 kilocalories a day. So you need that fuel. And if it's not in your fat because you burnt all that up, if it's not in your organ fat because you burnt all that up, then you start breaking down your own muscle. And I've come to the point at around day 60 something where I was burning so much muscle, I was seeing loss of function on the span of every other day. So when you are falling And it's such a scary kind of position to be in. Think about like if you're in your 90s and all of a sudden you're thinking you're walking, you just drop to the floor for whatever reason. That's how weak my legs were at that point. So knowing that, hey, I could probably lose function and it would take a long time for me to recover, that was the moment I decided to kind of play it safe and not risk my medical practicing abilities and go home.
Yeah, because you don't want to do permanent damage. I guess there comes a point where you could potentially do even brain damage, or you might start to cannibalize your vital organs.
Absolutely. At that point, once your muscles are being broken down, I would say your organs are next on the list. You know, it's just like your body's own menu of what it needs to take, and it is something I would never wish on my worst enemy, that feeling of starvation, because it's not only like a physical pain, it's a void that you can't really touch. You know, after the stomach pains dull out after weeks of starving, there's a void that is there that you can't really reach. And that's a sense of desperation that really requires so much mental and spiritual resilience that on our everyday training, people don't typically plan on.
Wow.
Yeah.
You talk about the calorie game and the importance of keeping warm, because so much heat is lost through thermogenesis, like just your body trying to create heat to keep warm. I mean, you're talking about 1.5 pounds a day. There's 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. So you're talking about 4,700 calories a day being consumed just staying warm.
Staying warm and just picking up sticks and processing your wood and hunting and checking your lines and fishing. Like all that requires a ton of calories. So one thing that's different between, hey, this is bushcraft stuff versus like survival for YouTube is like you really need to account for your calories and how you're planning. Like it's a game of chess out there to like the nth degree, because if you were doing something willy-nilly saying, hey, this is like a good shelter idea, and you just miscalculate one resource or one type of plan and you spend that amount of calories, you're basically killing like 3-4 days off of your timeline for rescue or for other opportunities. You know, and I think everyone in the history of that show has made that mistake once or another, whether that's building your shelter, whether that's bush bashing through the woods, whether that's hunting in locations that typically would not have game. We've all been there, and it's only in retrospect when you experience something like that that you really value how important it is to plan.
Yeah, because the shelter that you build, if it's not perfectly insulated, if it's not efficient, you're shaving days off because that's extra 500 calories a day that you need to keep warm by shivering or whatever it is, right? You're viewing everything in terms of calories.
Absolutely. Calories and resources that conserve calories. But one of the things that I would highly recommend for someone bugging out into the wilderness is really knowing what shelter locations optimizes natural kind of features. You know, like if you are next to an open field on the peak of a mountain or close to the peak of the mountain or in some kind of depression, those are areas that are just wildly exposed and areas that have a lot of cold air running through it. Might be a good idea in the summer months where it's very, very hot and your ideal situation is to keep cool. But if you're in a cold climate and you're in those locations, you're just going to burn calories for no good reason. So natural shelters and then building upon those are kind of your best bet. So having that keen eye and strategy for shelter building.
Well, there's a reason why they call them cavemen, right? Because that was like the best form of shelter. It was already made. It was concealed from the elements. It had some natural protection against predators. So if you can use the natural environment to limit the amount of work that you actually have to do, because that physical labor is an investment of calories, right? So as a doctor, did you find that you had a good understanding of your physiology as it progressed? I know Juan Pablo, when we had him on, he was talking about how he had practiced famine, starvation training prior to that he had fasted for extended periods of time. Do you find that enabled you to potentially have an edge over a lot of the other contestants?
I think it definitely gives you an edge, but it is a double edge. You know where those red lines are, you know what to prevent injury and how to heal injuries. So I would say a lot of the people who've been on Alone either tap themselves out or get pulled for medical reasons, or have challenges with medical issues. So I was very comfortable knowing what scope I could kind of potentially do minor things and even minor surgeries on. And I modified like my Leatherman to have some surgical instruments in there if need be. But at the same time, knowing where that firm red line is also definitely makes you kind of keen on when to call it, you know? So when I said like, hey, I'm probably going to rupture a tendon or have too much muscle mass loss that my organs were going to start to be eaten up, that was like my line. Versus if I did not know that line existed, I could have pushed. Because what people don't really get is how far the human body can push. When you look at encampments and prisoners of war, like they've gone so many more days and have had escapes when they were like 100 days plus in starvation mode. So your body can push so much further if your spirit is there, if your motivation is there, if your heart's in it.
Well, you think for, I don't know, thousands, I guess, depending on how far back you want to go in the evolutionary tree. Just pissed off a lot of our viewers in saying that. We struggled for thousands of years just trying to get calories. That was the whole game, right? So we are engineered to endure famine. But like you're saying, there's this series of physiological and psychological processes that accompany it that people today are just not familiar with. These are foreign feelings. What sort of advice would you have for people to spiritually, as you say, endure such conditions?
I think on a very basic level, what rituals do we have as men and women in our day-to-day society to either transition to adulthood, manhood, womanhood? There isn't a whole lot of challenging things. Like, is it getting your degree? Is it getting your driver's license? Like, it's not hard stuff. And that kind of lack of opportunity that you give yourself to not do those hard things is kind of a huge lost opportunity. So it might be something where it doesn't have
hard shit is what you're saying.
Do hard shit and do it often, fail often and be okay with it. I think that's the one thing that everyone right now, whether you're a city person, outdoor person, can do. And that hard thing is different for any individual. Like for my mom, which I was kind of like, that was the main reason that I was trying to inspire and kind of help her out of her situation. For her hard thing was just waking up and feeling like she was ready to like get out of bed. So if that's the hard thing for you, tomorrow, like your one hard thing is I'm going to get out of bed today, or I'm going to go to the gym today. Doesn't matter if I have a cold, if I'm feeling sick, if the weather's raining, just do that one hard thing and keep on building, because your definition of what is hard will change over time to the point where you can say like, hey, drop me anywhere naked and I'll be all right. So as you build on that and build on what failure means to you, if it's always in the point of like, even though I fail, I learned something, and tomorrow I'm going to do that hard thing until that hard thing is not hard anymore, then you get to the point where that resilience and that spirit is just like unbreakable.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that a lot of the mental illness that we see today is probably because people have been deprived of that. People have been deprived of those mortal challenges that would allow them to appreciate and just be grateful for things being good as they are. I've always thought that preppers, a lot of people say that we're technophobes and we're living in the past, but the reality is it's because we appreciate technology, civilization so much that we seek to preserve life, that we understand the value of it. And I think if people had those challenges and put themselves in those situations, like you're saying, it would give them a better baseline of appreciation for all the stuff that we have. And it would likely, I think it's the cure for a lot of, at one point I thought, maybe we should start some sort of therapy thing where you just dump people in the wild for, 10 days or something like that, and reset them, like a wilderness reset of sorts. Because you have to do that hard stuff in order for everything else to, by contrast, not seem as bad. Because we get so caught up in the city of what's important. And even I catch myself from day to day. I do these daily updates and I forget that, I'm a mortal being. I'm not going to be here forever. I'm going to die someday. The goal is not to live forever. It's just to have a high quality of life, do good, that sort of thing. But it's good to see people motivating themselves to take those challenges upon them. And I think you see this in a lot of aspects of our civilization, where people are doing these extreme activities in order to remind themselves that they're still alive. Like that's what you really were doing. You were, touching that
line, walking that line.
Exactly.
Yeah. I definitely think people can be stronger mentally and emotionally if they are doing those. And I think focusing their attention on things to be happy about, because one of the big problems or big kind of challenges with people with mental health is they tend to ruminate on things that are causing them dissonance, pain, suffering. And it's very hard to move from that mind space to like, what is actually really good in my life? Do I have food? Do I have water? Do I have people who care about me, who don't want me to like off myself? And once you start focusing on those points of appreciation and gratitude and really focus on talking to yourself in a kind way, that's the type of mentality and discipline, because it requires discipline to speak to yourself in a kind manner, to focus on things that you are grateful for. That's kind of the mindset that in every single survival kind of encounter, when we think about people who've gone through plane crashes out at sea, that's where their head is at. So it's something that we should definitely model in our everyday life, but also in our preparedness for the storms to come. Because if you are the type of person that always shits on yourself, if you're the type of person that always looks at the negative, in the long run, not only can that be detrimental to yourself, but it can be detrimental to your family and to your team and community. Like it only takes one negative person to off-throw the whole group. And it's so important that we focus so that our whole unit is strong.
I used to be a tree planter, and I did that for around 7 years. Every year we would, basically live in an encampment with sleeping under a tent, not like what you did, but still out there roughing it. What I found was that my mind almost went blank when I was out there. Like, how was your mind state when you were out there?
I would say peaceful. Coming from residency training, you have a buzzer on you, your phone on you, your work phone, emails, licensing issues, patients emailing you, and then going from that to complete silence was like the best sleep that I've had in years, the most peaceful I've been in many years. And it also speaks to how our attention is right now. Like most people can't pay attention to a 30-second, 60-second short, right? But when you're out there, you got to focus on everything, because there can be dangers, there can be predators hunting you, but at the same time, yeah. And you also have to pay attention for the potential animal behaviors and environmental changes to benefit from it, whether that's a hunting thing or whether that's a resource thing, whether that's planning for tomorrow. So your attention is more under your control in that set. You're not being distracted, you're being focused on what is around you. And that is a form of meditation. And I think that's why a lot of people find that peace when they're in the outdoors, because you need to be alert, and you are alert in a very natural way. And I think a lot of people heal when they're in the outdoors for that reason.
And I think it might explain why it seems like a lot of the contestants who win, or who make like the top, contestants like yourself, they're not the kind of, roughneck types that you would think. There's a certain soft power that is exhibited by those who can endure. It's kind of like a difference between a marathon runner and a sprinter. Marathon runner, smaller, leaner, whereas a sprinter is, like muscles and, fast twitch, right? And what I notice, a lot of people who win in alone, they always seem to be more, just more modest, soft-spoken, not the, big, hardcore, tactical military guys. They tend to be the people who can just have, like you say, have those conversations with themselves in order to find that peace. Because like you're saying, you're your own worst enemy out there.
Absolutely. And when you're that type of person where you're like genetically the big, strong person who's got all this military tactical training, your ego's like up here, So once you get humbled, it's hard, you see a lot of survival instructors out there, a lot of ex-Marines, ex-military people out there. And when they get humbled for the first time by nature, like it's very hard on their character and their ego to be like, do I think I could surpass this with all this training, with all this? Can I even do it? And because there's an out button, oftentimes that answer is no. And that's their kind of their own doing. If you kind of humble yourself and say like, or even take that out of the equation, saying like Juan Pablo, I know for him, it was like life or death. It's like, he is not going out of that challenge unless he is pulled out or he dies. If you're in that situation where you kind of change that narrative saying like, hey, like rescue is not coming, I have to be the strong one for my family or for my unit, then that changes it from ego to something greater than yourself. And that is such an important change, because honestly, no matter how strong you are, no matter where your ego is, you don't necessarily push yourself beyond what you think you're capable of just on yourself alone. You got to you have to dig deep for that higher purpose, whether that's your children, your partner, or your mission. And once you're in that state, like you could move mountains with no effort.
One of the things that I've wrestled with in my wilderness escapades has been wrestling with nature. Like really, you find that a lot of people like that who are, there's a place for that, right? In the military, in tactical operations.
Absolutely.
There's a place for wanting to control all the aspects of the equation. But there's also a certain aspect of survival that involves assimilating to nature's rules as opposed to trying to control every variable. So now that's not going to be a survival strategy in every condition, especially what we talk about with preppers. There's a time when you need a hammer, and there's a time when you need a screwdriver, right? But in that kind of long-term survival situation that you guys were in, that more sloth-like approach to things is required in order to endure for a long period of time.
Absolutely. And to notice what resources are available and to strategize as well. If you are kind of going there, making a fob, that's what you need to do. If it's a great defensive position, if you have a good evacuation route and you have good cover and good concealment, that's what you need to do in that moment. But if you are, let's say, like you mentioned, having a bush plane and you are literally going to a place where no one else can reach you, burning that amount to have that amount of aggression to set up that situation is going to limit the amount of calories you have and the amount of days you can kind of operate at a high level. So having almost the mindset of and the kind of motions of a primitive living kind of curriculum or kind of mindset and way of doing things is really, really important. That's why I love training people through that whole spectrum, where you start almost like a bushcraft type of person and you go through that whole spectrum and then end at primitive living skills. Because to do long term, like it's a reason why it's called living skills and not like survival or something like that. It's you're living, and that way to live long term and to be viable and thrive long term is that type of motions in my experience.
One of the hardest things for me, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the disconnecting from society. Did they tell you what was going on in the world when you were out there?
So we were there during COVID, so it could have been.
What year was it when you filmed?
21.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was like early 2021 or?
Early 2021.
So it was right when things were kind of getting going then.
So you didn't know, like at that time, I was a medical resident when COVID hit.
I'm surprised they were still filming then. I mean, I guess you're in isolation.
Yeah, you're best self-isolating
Right.
to the biggest degree, right?
Yeah.
You're in the middle of nowhere. And
Were you worried that, like, shit, what if something goes down when I'm out here?
that was definitely a thought, especially when the majority of my family aren't prepared. They are heavily reliant on structures and resources from the government, from our systems. So that was definitely something that played on my mind. But at the same time, my job out there was to be as genuine as possible to make sure that I came home in one piece. Because it's an experience that can break some people. There have been people that came back with PTSD, and that's something that I didn't want for myself. I didn't want that for my family. Because at the end of the day, like it's a legacy that I want to pass on to my followers, my students, and most importantly, my own children. And if you have that trauma, it's very hard to do it in that type of nurturing way.
One of the most challenging things for me would be the disconnection, because it's part of my everyday routine, doing the daily updates, being aware of global events. But I think even for the average person who's got that TikTok brain, like you were talking before, the attention span just gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And quite frankly, I hate making short videos. I do. I'm going to say right now, I hate making short videos, but you have to do it because people, as much as I say I hate them, doesn't mean I don't watch them.
Yeah.
Right? So I hate what we're becoming as a society, but in order for you to do this thing where you have a YouTube channel, you almost have to make them. But, I think one of the most challenging parts, if there ever was a grid down situation, would be people adapting to that silence. There's something you call drop shock. Maybe you can explain a bit about what that is.
Absolutely.
And if you could walk us through, the point of when you were dropped on your own in isolation, because I think there's valuable things to be learned there from our audience. If you're ever in a situation where you truly are alone, now you have a button, and I know there's going to be some survival purists who say, oh, they have a button, so it's not real survival, but whatever. But explain to us what drop shock is and talk about the progression of just sensory destimulation that happens.
So drop shock typically happens when you are placed in a very new environment. It might be deployment, and it might be something like alone or in an off-grid situation where you need to bug out to a location that you're not familiar with. Maybe you've done a few camping trips, but you're bugging out for a particular reason, right? There's a threat. And when you go to a new area that you're not super familiar with, your brain's all on that heightened kind of level. You're kind of listening for threats. You're kind of worried about X, Y, and Z. And especially if you are doing it as a head of household, you're worrying about your kid that hasn't a whole lot of experience. You're worrying about your wife that may be a city person. And you have all this emotions and kind of hypervigilance going on. And it's almost crazy to see and notice all the little details that you miss because you're so hyper focused on those stressors. So drop shock,
vision.
Yeah, you get tunnel vision. So drop shock is all that emotions kind of compiled into one, and knowing that for whatever reason, no one's coming to help you. You don't have access to the things that you typically have access to, and it takes some time to adjust.
And even though you have a button, I gotta say, for people who are not familiar with the show, it still will take them a period of time to come and rescue you if something did happen. Yeah. So there still is an element of, if a bear comes, you're fighting that bear or whatever, right?
And it was one of the reasons why I recommend that everyone knows how to treat life-threatening injuries and illnesses. Because even on alone, and even if you are an outdoorsman, backcountry camper, when you press that button, it's weather dependent as well. So there have been times on the show where rescue will not come for you because the helicopters can't fly in that conditions, and the river is frozen to the point where, hey, the boat can't come on it. So it might be the case where they say, don't do stupid shit because we can't get you. So
I think I've seen an episode where the chopper couldn't come in and they had to send an expedition crew on foot to come and get the guy.
Yeah. So even though we have a button, if you are imminently going to die, you will die in that situation if you're stupid about how you're handling your blades, if you get into a mauling accident or something like that and you don't know how to stop a bleed. So that becomes a very real situation. And we've had people on the show that have a history of heart disease, who've had heart attacks in the past. And then they're out there for their first few days, noticing how their body's changing, how their chemistry changes, and they have chest pain. That's a very scary situation to be in, you know, to say like, hey, I'm having a heart attack and I don't have a cath lab out here. I don't have a doctor or a surgeon to pull out that clot for me. So when we come to this spectrum of kind of survival medicine, it's not only about kind of saving a life in that instant if you get shot or if anything like that. It's also about the preventative stuff, so that you're not the type of person who's morbidly obese. You're not the type of person who's addicted to smoking. And you're not the type of person who is so diabetic that you're requiring field amputations and your vision goes and you become a burden to your group. You know, so that's also a side of survival medicine and preparedness that a lot of people don't take into account, because we live in a society where there is abundance, where there is addictive things.
The one you take to lose weight nowadays, they're all the
Ozempic.
Yeah, we live in the Ozempic age.
Yeah.
Where, you know, and this is why one of the biggest things I try to advise people as a prepper is like, you got to put your health at the forefront. I mean, it's all about survival. So if you know that poor lifestyle choices are going to reduce your lifespan, then the best way, the easiest, way to survive longer is to make the proper lifestyle choices, like do that preventative stuff, like you're saying. But even the ability to identify it, as your medical training would allow you to identify certain things that others might not see, right? So that probably gave you a bit of an edge in that you could, I'm sure when you're out there in the bush, you're thinking about Grey's Anatomy, what am I, how is everything working? I couldn't imagine, the self-diagnostics that were going on there throughout that process.
Yeah, I think one of the things that hits you very soon is that process of ketosis. We have some keto diet people out in the audience who knows how that feels like. You just feel like shit. It feels like you ran a marathon, got hit by a train, and then had to go back to your work job at 6 a.m. for like an accounting thing. It feels horrible. And a lot of people who don't know how that feels like, who don't know what to notice to know that, hey, this is the reason why I'm feeling this way, will feel like my body's shutting down. And you see a lot of people within the first 2 weeks or so, that's when it really hits you, tap on alone, because they're like, oh, like my body's failing me. No, you're going through ketosis. So if you don't know what that feels like, and you don't know how to diagnose it, how your breath changes, how your energy wise you feel different, how the brain fogginess feels, then it can be very scary.
Now, I've done intermittent fasting. I've done periods where I'll go 16 hours, a day. And I've noticed that my energy levels actually increase in the short term. I've never, went longer. I know that we've done videos on starvation and famine, and that over time, there's this period of heightened mental acuity when that the body is conditioned to have, because in the prehistoric age, I guess you could say, it was imperative that we had that extra adrenaline, that extra burst of energy, so we can go and hunt that animal. So when you're starving, everything is firing on all cylinders. Did you find that when you were out there, like a heightened sense of your surroundings?
Absolutely. So one of the things that was one of the biggest challenges on Alone Season 9 for me was I never hunted before. Like, I've shot recurve for over 7 years at that point.
And this is the craziest thing.
Yeah.
You never hunted and you almost won the competition.
Yeah.
So, that right there is a testament. I'm sure you had your military training and you're a doctor, and okay. Yeah. We're not just saying anybody can go out there and do this, but that's worth noting, is that you never hunted before and you learned all this stuff on the fly. So tell us a bit about, sorry to interrupt you, but I just thought that people should know that, because that's quite the data point. So like you were mentioning, a lot of your senses get heightened in that environment. And my biggest challenge initially, my first big challenge, was I never hunted. So my plan was to get fish. You can fly fish on Alone Season 9. So that was my main thing.
And the first few days, like I was getting strikes for every time I put a fly in. I was getting fish. And after day 3, silence. It got cold real fast. The water level dropped like about 1.5 feet. And I was getting nothing, not even any kind of sign that like things were biting. And at that,
And you can only fly fish.
you can only fly fish. You could not drop a net in. You couldn't do baits. You couldn't do trot lines, which would have been awesome because
And was that due to like the
hunting regulations.
Okay.
Hunting and fishing regulations. So ideally, that's what you would do. If you have a survival net, throw it in there and check on it. If you have line and you can bait that and make a trot line with like 7 different hooks, do that. Put it in. Put multiples in. But if you are stuck on a show like that with like fishing and hunting regulations, and you can only do fly fishing, once that is dried up,
But when the shit hits the fan,
yeah,
you don't have to worry about that.
you don't have to worry about
No more
that.
government.
Exactly. And at that moment where I was like 12 days in and no kind of animal protein, I was like, I have to change my strategies. Because for me, as someone who's kind of like having their specialty in cold weather warfare, I wanted to see snow, like I wanted to be there and kind of demonstrate to myself and to my family, like this is how you could thrive in a very cold environment. So
Was this coming out of winter or going into winter?
Going into winter. So you're there after everything has been picked apart. Like the berry patches were almost gone. You didn't really have a whole lot of vegetation and flowers. You were digging for scraps of roots at that point. And I had to switch my strategies to hunting. I put up some snares, wasn't really successful. And then like kind of like a
You brought
sign.
snare wire or did you use rope?
Yep, I brought snare wire, and I highly recommend that if you're thinking about long-term survival, because it's just so much more effective at small game snaring than rope is. And I started snaring and started hunting. And that hypervigilance, you start to notice different sounds. Okay, this means that this animal is doing this. Then you're also observing animal behaviors, and that's the real truth to being successful as a hunter. Not only having a good shot or the right rifle or that crossbow or whatever, but what is that animal known to do? And once I was kind of keyed into that, I knew that every 3 to 4 days, the grouse would come down from the mountains to pick out grit from the stream that my shelter was next to so that they could chew their food. And they had to do that to survive. They had to have that grit to survive. So instead of bush bashing for 3 days to find them, I would wait at my shelter. I knew what they sounded like when they were coming down from the mountains. And I would wake up, walk out of my shelter within 15 feet, take a shot and get food.
With your bow?
With my bow, yeah. And then for smaller animals like squirrels, I knew that like they are such a small animal to take a shot at, and they're squirrely, that if you are taking those random shots, the likelihood of you getting it as someone who doesn't hunt is very low. But I was very strategically taking shots at when they were eating and when they were burrowing from like point A to point B. Those are the only times I would take a shot. And I was getting like headshots off of that. And I was getting very consistent food from that, because like I would say like 80 to 90% of the shots that I took when I was doing those strategies were kill shots. And that meant I got to eat that day.
So when you were first tearing into that first squirrel, did the hunger override any sense of disgust? Like, because that's something, I think a lot of people think, well, you look at how a dog can eat raw meat or something, like, how can they do that? But you're not thinking about it from the perspective of animal needing sustenance. Did it taste different? Was it like, is it taste better?
Just like if any of you play sports or have done like a long hike, that burger on the way home is like the best burger you can possibly eat. And it's no different in a survival situation where at that point I had fish, I had grouse, but I was craving red meat. So once I got into that red meat, it was absolutely delicious. And one thing that I recommend to every single prepper who's prepping food is make sure you have salts. And
did they allow you to bring salt?
So
how much salt could you bring?
Not a whole lot. It was like less than a pound of salt.
Okay, it's still a decent
amount.
Yeah.
But the thing is,
that was smart.
Yeah. The reason why, if you look at the list of people from Alone Season 9, a lot of people brought salt blocks and so forth. All the contestants, because we had a little bit of a chat prior, they opted for salt after they talked to me, because they could not convince me to drop that item. because that counts as one of your 10 items. And there was no one on my season that said, hey, you should bring your saw instead. You should bring a fixed blade instead. And they could not make me budge on that. And knowing that I was a doctor, they're like, okay, maybe that's super important. But the one thing...
So you convinced other contestants to bring salt.
Because I would not budge on that. It's like, that is the one item that I would not change.
Took salt over a silky saw. But you should still get a silky saw.
You should still get a silky saw.
CanadianPreparedness.com. Yeah.
If you have more choices and you don't have to limit your choices to 10, silky saw is the type of saw that I would probably bring out there.
Nice. But salt is first.
Salt would be a priority.
There's a reason why it was currency at one point.
Exactly. And to be more specific, let's say you're starving. And the reason why I was still able to function at a high level, still able to hunt, because we saw people who were unable to hunt at a certain point because of muscle cramps and so forth, feeling lightheaded, feeling like they might pass out. Even if you're drinking enough water, it's hard for that water to stay inside your blood vessels if you don't have that salt. And specifically when we think about, hey, I'm an ER doctor treating people with like dehydration and issues with their electrolytes, potassium, sodium, magnesium. Those would be like the three that I say, like, if you don't have that in your salt mix, think again and choose something else, because that will enable you to keep the potassium in your bloodstream, which is very important, not only for muscle cramps, but also heart function. So we see people in long-term survival states that have a very low potassium, and they're like, oh, electrolyte dehydration, no big whoop. But what people fail to realize is that not only is it muscle function, it's heart function too. And you can put yourself in a very fatal arrhythmia that can kill you in minutes or seconds. So that's why potassium is so important. And the reason why I opted for a lower amount of salt instead of a salt block, because a salt block, if you look at that, you can bait animals with it and so forth. But that's just sodium chloride. You know, even Himalayan salt, you have some minerals and so forth, but that's not going to give you the same function as potassium and magnesium. And you need...
That's what's in the salt.
The salt mix that I did, because they just mentioned salt, right? So I said like magnesium chloride's a salt, like sodium chloride's a salt, potassium chloride's a salt. So I'm going to make my own salt mix that I knew
you're going for potassium chloride. That's the ideal.
Potassium, sodium, and magnesium. So you want a mixture of it. So when we think about like people who need to come to the ER, like normal saline is what I give you. Potassium chloride in the IV is what I give you. Magnesium is what I give you. Magnesium sulfate. So these are the things that, like, when people get all messed up and come to the emergency department, that's the stuff that I'm putting through the IV. That's what I'm pumping into you. So in a survival situation, you better bet when you're dehydrated from running from a threat and sweating and like actually handling all the kit that you actually have, because even at a bare minimum, your pack's going to be more than 40 pounds. So if you're rucking with that, you're going to have that depleted salt, that issue. Your muscles are going to cramp. And then if you seize up and you're in a firefight, that's... you're shit out of luck.
Yeah, we've done some videos where we've talked about salt, and I've always encouraged people to put salt in their bug out bag, but I'm surprised that you actually chose that as an item. What were some of the other items that you brought? Are you at liberty to talk? Yep. I guess you are, because the season's already been broadcast. So what are the 10 items that you took, and why did you choose them?
So when we think about like survival priorities and survival items, like Dave Canterbury does a great job at like his 5 C's, 10 C's. So in some element, you want to replicate something like that. So you have like your cutting tools. For me, I am most comfortable with my forest axe. So it's like a 2-pound head. You can split big chunks of wood with that, but at the same time, it's small enough that you're not wielding like a huge axe to do some small kind of task for making a shelter or so forth.
Are you allowed to bring a larger axe if you want?
Yep, you are. You are, absolutely. So if you want to fell trees and that type of thing, you can absolutely do that. My specific axe that I brought was a Husqvarna carpenter's axe. And I've been using that for over a decade now. So it was like my axe, you know, like it was almost like an old friend. So I brought him, and then also my Leatherman. So I brought a Leatherman that I specifically modified. So,
did anybody bring axes with synthetic handles?
I believe so. In the past, they have.
Okay.
Yeah. And me personally, I haven't put it through the ringer in specific cold weather. And sometimes those synthetic axes, like Fiskars is a good one. Like I have that in my truck. I haven't really put it through the ringer in cold environments to see how that composite deals with like sub 30 Celsius temperatures, like whether it shatters or not. And at the same time, you want to get comfortable with sharpening those types of axe heads because they might need like a more robust diamond file to get sharp. But after the axe, like for me, was like food for the most part. So I had my recurve bow. You're allowed, I believe, like 9 arrows. So you have to decide, like, hey, are they all going to be broadheads? Are they going to have some small game points to it?
I noticed there was a few points in the show where you're showing yourself shooting. Did you lose a lot of arrows?
I lost one.
Okay, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I lost one and I made 2 out there. And
did you shoot something successfully with the 2 that you made?
I shot successfully, and then I had to do a kill shot. So the big issue with grouse is once they feel threatened, they're up in the tree. But if you are shooting a broadhead, the moment you shoot it, if it gets stuck in something, you have to climb a tree to get your arrow. Or if it gets lost, like it's going way, way far. So you really have to be strategic on where you're shooting. So there was a river on my downstream kind of location, and on the upside was like the mountain. So I would have to kind of like skirt around so that I was taking mountain shots, and I was kind of aiming so that if my arrows did miss, they would hit like the main trunk of the tree.
Yeah.
So it would kind of bounce off and fall down. But yeah, if you lose an arrow, it's such a huge resource because it is like a factory made aerodynamic tool that is meant to kill and to kill very effectively. The arrows that I made were specifically made to get things out of trees. So like they're blunt tipped and hardened. And then I had the barbed wire type of things that I improvised to make it so that if they do pierce, they kind of like stay in there. So I was getting grouse out of trees and then taking that kill shot with my commercial grade arrows.
So you had your bow, and I'm assuming that you were training with that in the run up to the show, that you'd use that. How long were you doing archery before you?
So I shot recurve for about 7 years at that point. And then the big change is like even if you shoot recurve or shoot a bow, if you only do target shooting, that's only one arrowhead that you're used to.
Yeah.
Now, if you're in a survival situation and you have small game points, large game points, broadheads, like multiple different arrows, you have to adjust your distances and how you're shooting to the head itself, because they're different weights, they're different aerodynamics to it. So that was the big kind of lead up to my training. It was like shooting with broadheads, shooting with different small points, and you're competing at a level where people are like 20 yards out and they're hitting like bottle caps. And I was nowhere near that. So like a lot of the shots that I took were within like 14 meters, you know? So you got to train your distances. You got to train with different arrowheads as well.
What kind of bow are you allowed? Like, can you pick the make and model, or is there a poundage restrictions, or like what was the?
There's a poundage minimum. So you want to be able to take a bow that has an ethical kill poundage. And at the same time, just for the aesthetic of the show, they probably would want something that's more rustic looking. But you can't take a compound bow out there. That would be a little too easy.
You, obviously hunting and fishing regulations, were you able to shoot deer or any big game?
The big game for Alone Season 9 was black bear.
Okay.
And the black bear in Labrador were very aggressive, known to be predatory. So they're one of the only kind of groups that actually goes out of their way to hunt caribou. So when they're hunting like a 400 to 800 pound animal and you're there at like 160 pounds, it's you
don't have horns.
Yeah, you don't have horns. You got to make sure that the shot that you take is a good kill shot.
Not a piss off shot.
Yeah, not a piss off shot.
Well, we'll talk about bears, but let's save that for a bit. What are the other items that you brought?
Yeah. So I brought paracord. Can make netting out of that to use for your shelter. Brought my sleeping bag, which I think is one of the most important things.
Have you ever heard of survivor cord?
I have heard of survival cord.
Do they let you bring it?
No,
because
that would be multiple different
line,
fishing line,
all that stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And at the same time, like if you're using that, to my personal opinion is if you are thinking about survival cord, like and putting it in a bracelet and it has like wire in it, fishing line in it, it's just like a point where it's just wearing and tearing. So is it a reliable fishing line at that point when it's on your wrist, moving around, or is the trapping wire like reasonable and not having a lot of memory from all that bending, I would much rather bring a coil of specific brass or stainless steel trapping wire versus a survival bracelet. And same thing for like fire starters. Like I would rather have my like dedicated fire starters versus relying on a little bit of waxed
jute twine.
Yeah. So I had the paracord, I had the pot, I had the sleeping bag, and then I had like fishing line and my fire starter. Those were like the main things. And then the salt. The mix that I was...
You had a ration too, didn't you?
So it was like the salt, and then it was rice and then sugar. That was kind of like the mix that you can do that was under like a pound.
Rice and sugar.
Yeah.
And how much rice did they give you?
It was like a fraction of a pound.
Okay.
And the reason why I did that was the main kind of thing for alone is kind of like contamination. So if you don't know proper hygiene, you can get giardia, you can get all sorts of gut infections quite easily. So the reason why I brought that was not only to perform at a high function with the electrolytes, but also to stave off dysentery. So if you're shitting out your brains, like you're probably going to tap for that reason. But if you have that ration that could sustain you for 2 weeks from a medical standpoint, and then after those 2 weeks, you're bound to back to day one and you can still operate at a high level, that's super important. Rice water is the WHO's backup for electrolyte mixes in developing countries for dysentery specifically. It has very easy to digest starches, amino acids, and you can rehydrate someone with just rice water. So not even using the resource, just using the water it was soaked in. And for starvation, just a little bit of rice, like a small little handful of it, you're able to make porridge. So on Thanksgiving, like I had a whole 2 liter, like greater than 2 liter pot full of rice porridge and like cranberry and like grouse in there. And it felt like a feast. And it was just like less than a handful of rice.
That's a meal you'll remember forever.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
You don't get that in the city, that kind of cuisine. So you got the sleeping bag, and that's the only ration that they allow you to take. There's no...
You can take up to 2, I believe.
Okay.
And there's kind of different things you can go about it. Like if you take if I were to pick a second one, it'd probably be something that had a high fat content. So if you're taking like pemmican that has like fats and proteins and berries in it, that would be a good option. If you're able to pick like a self-made like lard that has all the salts in it, that would be like a great option as well. Because from a weight per calorie type of standpoint, fats is kind of like the best bang for your buck.
So let's talk about bears. How prepared were you to deal with a situation like that?
At a certain point, it's no longer like I'm scared of this. It's like, come at me because I want to eat you, because I want that fat, I want that fur, I want all those resources.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.